Okay, I think we have a critical mass. I'm going to start. Hi, I'm Jamillah James. I'm Senior Curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, ICA LA. Thank you for tuning into this conversation with Ron Athey and Amelia Jones on the occasion of the exhibition Queer Communion, Ron Athey, which is curated by Amelia Jones, which is a 40-year survey and the first solo institutional exhibition dedicated to the life and work of the pioneering and fabulous LA-based performance artist Ron Athey, who is very near and dear to all of our hearts. This show is currently on view at the ICA LA through September 5th. I want to say a special thanks to the supporters of the show who made the show possible, which is the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs, Laura Donnelly and the Good Works Foundation, Tim Disney, the Audrey and Sydney Ermis Charitable Foundation, and the Michael Asher Foundation. And ICA LA is also supported collectively by the Curators Council, Fieldwork, and the 1717 Collective. In addition to Queer Communion, in our project room, we are hosting Silent Spikes, a presentation of new video by Brooklyn-based artist Kenneth Tam, which is organized by the Queens Museum. To see both of these exhibitions in person, which you should most certainly do, please schedule an appointment at theicala.org/visit. If you have questions for Ron and Amelia during the event, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible towards the end of the program. So now on to our special guests. LA-based artist Ron Athey has been working at the vanguard of performance art for over 30 years. Self-taught, he has performed extensively at clubs, alternative spaces, festivals, and museums in the US and abroad. Athey formed a company of performers in the 1990s, producing the Torture Trilogy, addressing the AIDS pandemic through memorializing and philosophical reflection. He developed genre-stretching theatrical works like Joyce from 2002, the Judas Cradle in 2005, and major solo performances including Sebastiane in 2014, Incorruptible Flesh in 2006, and The Solar Anus from 1998. Currently, Athey is performing Gifts of the Spirit, which returns to his Pentecostal roots with an embodied performance anchored in the spiritual, and Acephalous Monster, a multimedia performance with projections, readings, lectures, and appropriated text and sound. Amelia Jones is the Robert A. Day Professor and Vice Dean of Academics and Research at the Roski School of Art and Design at the University of Southern California, and is a curator and scholar of contemporary art, performance, and feminist and sexuality studies. Recent publications include Seeing Differently, A History and Theory of Identification in the Visual Arts from 2012, a volume co-edited with Aaron Silver, Otherwise, Imagining Queer Feminist Histories from 2016, and the edited special issue on trans performance of Performance Research, also from 2016. Jones's catalog, Queer Communion, Ron Athey, co-edited with Andy Campbell, is listed among the New York Times Best Art Books of 2020, and rightfully so. Her book entitled In Between Subjects, A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance is just out on Routledge Press and explores the history of performance art and queer theory since the 1950s from a queer feminist point of view. I wanted to say welcome to you both for joining us and for making this fantastic and important exhibition that we have on view at the museum. So I wanted to start with a question that may seem obvious, but I think it's important. Thank you. I wanted to start with a question that may seem obvious, but is important to framing how an exhibition is made, in particular, this exhibition, which is so much about community and coming together. And that question is, when did your friendship and working relationship start? And at what point did you start thinking about or working on a survey about Ron?
I mean, I can just throw in that I became aware of Ron first, by seeing his work, and that was through Sherry Rose and Bob Flanagan, who told me we have this crazy friend and you have to see his performance at the Highways 18th Street complex, and that was 1994. And then I think we just kind of gradually saw each other around and about, and then both lived in England at the kind of overlapped in the early 2000s. And that's when I really started to follow your work closely, Ron, and we got to know each other a bit better. And then when we both moved back here, by then the idea for the show was already percolating. And Ron had to leave your longtime apartment, rent control apartment. So the archive was going to be kind of homeless. And my partner and I offered to bring it over, and living with the archive, I think, made the show a different show because, you know, it just takes a different shape when you're constantly thinking about the objects and the work. So that's kind of my short nutshell version, but Ron, you might have something to add.
Well, I do, from the point of view that in the 90s, there were so few books about performance and monographs about performance artists. So there was Cindy Carr's On Edge. If you were really in the know, you could get the Stellar Hook book. And then there was your book. So then the canon started opening up. So I always felt like I had to sort of collect and read and represent these books to see how accurate they were. And that, you know, in some cases, they weren't restricted to high art spaces or academia. So that was kind of important for me to start looking for context. And you're one of those people. And becoming closer took a decade or two, but we got in tight.
Yeah. No, you can't separate us. We go everywhere together. No, just kidding. Yeah, so it really it is a good story because I think it actually exemplifies the kind of community questions that I was trying to raise with the show. And I think that's why that seemed obvious as a way to organize the material, was because I came out of a slightly different, you know, set of friendships in LA, but then we started to intersect, and we intersected in the UK. So that just became the way that I saw Ron's work really having this vast impact, even for people who might not have seen performances live. You know, you would just kind of go to a social event with members of the live art community in the UK, and, you know, it would be there. It was part of what people were thinking about and talking about. And so organizing it that way, to me, was a way of emphasizing the profound importance of the work rather than kind of de-emphasizing it, which, you know, I suppose in a superficial way, it might seem like, well, you're not really focusing on the artist, but it is a focus on the artist because Ron has been part of so many different communities and ways of thinking that it was just really exciting to me. It was like working with a living, you know, example of someone who lives a creative queer life. And to me, that was exemplary.
And I think for
community for me, because I think sometimes when people talk about community, they think it's our responsibility just to form a community or join a community.
Yeah.
And I feel like the communities that changed me were communities that had to exist to survive. So
yeah,
the AIDS activist, AIDS support system community really only existed in the height of the pandemic. So we had to come together. And the closeness is unparalleled to any other scene I've been with. The early homeless punk scene was also about survival, about being parentless, about being queer and kicked out. It wasn't this newer generation that's more loving, like where your parents try to help you step through your journey or eventually do. It was more like you're just kicked out. So I just state that sometimes these communities are about survival, and then they get deeper than blood.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, because that's the reason actually I wanted to, one of the events that ICA is facilitating is also a USC Roski event, and it's in August on the 31st, and it's on queer survivance. Because I think that question of, it's not just about like, oh, you know, let's form a community to show our work together. I mean, sometimes it's just, it's reactive to parts of society that are literally not just marginalizing you, but hunting you down, or, you know, wishing for your demise. And so it's a really deep thing, that aspect of community. And I think I think it really comes out in your work, Ron, but also in all of the elements of the archive. And the opening on Sunday was just like so much better than I could have imagined, because there were all these people from all these communities there, you know, and to see that they were gratified by it and that it meant something to them was really just amazing.
Well, the nerves are unparalleled having a hometown retrospective. That, so, you know, someone from the people from the 80s, people from the 90s, people from the noughties, the teenies. Yeah, it's like all kind of chapters and roads that have went down. It's like random. So you have to be ready to either be poker faced or just dive in and have the reunion.
Yeah.
I love
it.
Yeah, and the exhibition, in an interesting way, functions not just as like a portrait of Ron, your life and your work, but also of these various interrelated communities that have come together that may or may not have, you know, enough of its history preserved in one way or another. So I think one of the real treats of this exhibition is to get to see, you know, LA of a certain time, London of a certain time, and how your work weaves in and out of that, and the various groups and scenes that you're involved in kind of come together and support and form this informal history.
I have always been interested in scenes, because I've been in ones where when they're at that sublime high pitch, and sometimes they last for like 3 years and then they go away. You think, what happened and how can I start another one? But I think early on, one of the great books I read with that has a West Coast chapter was John Savage's England's Dreaming.
Yeah.
And he reckons the West Coast punk scene went on for like 9 years because the media didn't give a shit about it. So people didn't come into living cartoons, like a parody of a cartoon of a representation of a punk. Like after there's too many punk movies and too many people have had a band for 3 months and then they're on primetime TV.
Yeah.
Because that slurping thing that accelerated in the 90s, and it made scenes less potent. I've always been hungry for the knowledge of what makes a scene.
Yeah, I feel like scenes ebb and flow. I mean, you've been involved in various scenes, like the death rock scene, the goth scene, the punk scene. Music is always changing and flowing and, you know, fizzling out, coming back together. There's always other factors that impact whether or not a scene survives. Like if a space closes down where people are coming together. Yeah, yeah. So it's always this cyclical thing. And I think like every generation has like all of these different things that cross-pollinate and that give artists, you know, a lot of energy and a community and spaces that they can call their own, which is, you know, one of the things that's really exciting about this particular city, because I think a lot of that ethos still very much exists here in Los Angeles.
Yeah, it is. It's exciting to think about what's specific to LA in your work, Ron, and obviously your childhood in Pomona, and you know the particular kind of charismatic religious traditions you were exposed to, but also, yeah, the freedom for creative people in LA, not the ones in the film industry because that's an industry, but when I moved here from the East Coast in the late 80s, it was just so wide open because everything was cheap and anyone could do anything. There really weren't the kind of power structures and difficulties that you automatically would step into in New York if you moved there and tried to write art criticism or curate shows. And I am thrilled to see so many younger generations moving here, but also just kind of reactivating. But I do worry a lot about the price of real estate because that will kill, you know, scenes basically. Like you really need to have an accessible city that young people can afford to live in. And also older people who are artists, you know, who don't get kicked to the side because suddenly rents are exploding. So I think we need to keep talking about that and even keep pressuring the city to stop favoring, real estate developers and start thinking about what made this city the best place to be in the 20th century, to continue that, to make it possible.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So artists are often going back to, Ron's upbringing in Pomona, and that being a starting place really for the exhibition, which is loosely chronological and organized thematically under different rubrics. So artists are often reticent to use the biographical as a lens through which to consider the work and a practice, but this is fully embraced in this exhibition as a curatorial strategy and as a starting place. So I'd like for you both to talk about why it was important to start with the family section, just to kind of unpack for the audience some of the curatorial thinking about starting with that, especially since Joyce is a later work in the trajectory.
Yeah, that speaks to what I think of as a recursive chronology, that, you have to situate the work at its origins, but even so, you see the continuation and the deliberate enactment of those early elements throughout the career. So you're constantly seeing themes and elements repeat and return. And Ron, one of the most mind-blowing elements of your work is that ability to repeat with a difference. So you take the same element and you see it in numerous places. But also Joyce, which is the piece about Ron's upbringing and mother, is this one of the most visceral, haunting pieces of your entire career, I think, because it's so deliberately personal. And you can't not address your biography, since you have publicly written and elaborated on it in relation to the work. And I actually found that so freeing. I didn't have to worry, is the artist going to be upset? No, because it's right there. And some of your most beautiful published writings are the ones that expand this kind of gifts of the spirit idea, where you're elaborating on family, but constantly in relation to other elements, other communities, other scenes, other ideas. So yeah, for me, that was I loved just beginning with some documentation from your childhood, but more importantly, the theme of family as you had to experience it and as you survived it, and then kind of go on to elaborate it in other pieces. And then you move through those other scenes and you see some of those elements echoing.
Well, I had to establish a logic for myself just to move forward as a human being leaving home. While my mother's central, it's because she was always absent. My mother has been institutionalized since the 60s. So no mother, no father, raised by strange, abusive religious relatives, and a kind of post-white flight Pomona. I just think those things are the things that make me, and we live in the cult of the family, where I think people fetishize their family. And I don't just want to fetishize the horror story. I mean, the first thing I started writing that became Gifts of Spirit was called Reinterpretation of False Prophecies. So I had to kind of understand how I'm wired the way I am through this Pentecostalism, spiritualism. There's also scrying and automatic writing as part of my childhood as well. Those supply the logic for the kind of research I did later, I think. So I include it, but it's maybe not in that usual biography way. It just fits in a certain way.
Yeah, and the catalog, for those listening, has a section of Ron's writings, some of which are never published before, so they're from the archive, and it's a really wonderful way to see the beauty of your writing, but also how you work and rework themes and how they show up in other places.
And just to talk about Joyce is the name of my mother, and the piece has each member of the family, of all the women and me. But then the videos are all the schisms and the harsher action. So it is, you know, it is Paul Preciado post-porn. It's beyond violent. Like, there's no way to lighten the gene action as Ronnie Lee. The self-mutilation is real, and it has pathos. It's also poetic and beautiful in some ways. And then some of the other things are just about neurosis and tics. So it is a family story, but it's also a psychoneurology story. Sexual psychoneurology, that'll be the word.
It might be worth saying too that Joyce was viewed by very few people. It was performed only 3 times in the UK and Germany. And so Ron worked with Glenn Fogel for the first venue participant to make it into an installation. So it's a really exciting opportunity to see like a really kind of a how do you curate performance art question. This is a great example of a beautiful way to kind of recall a piece without presuming to fully represent it. And it works.
The original video work is shot by Cyril Kuhn, and it was a pretty perfect 3-screen video that was just meant to be blown up as big as possible with a stage built on top of it. So this was all done in residence at Kampnagel in Hamburg, and then went on via Fierce Festival in Birmingham, a 3-city UK tour. And then never showed in the US. I wasn't off the blacklist yet, so I couldn't have shown anything that expensive in the US because I always had to self-produce in those middle years. So I was just like, fuck it, it's not going to show here. So when the chance to see it as a video, so I wasn't really interested in restaging the whole thing. It was important, but some of the elements were damaged or missing. And also, just as we're in the process of that, Hannah Sem died from, you know, the amazing movement performance duo Osseous Labyrinth. So then, you know, for the sake of legacy and memory of her and her inclusion in that, now, you know, how hard I worked with her on that role, that it became extra important to include that. The missing are very important for me.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So the show, there's certain issues around curating performance and curating exhibitions about people that work in performance. And Amelia, you've written extensively on performance. You know, my foundations as an art historian were reading your writings on performance and then translating that into making an exhibition. It's, you know, it's definitely a challenging process. So I want to hear from you, and then the both of you, about how you wanted Queer Communion to be different than recent exhibitions about performance artists.
Yeah, I wanted it to be like a lived experience, but not one that was pretending to be a performance, you know, or to somehow be the same as performance. And I have to say, Ron's aesthetic coming in kind of at the last minute with extra props and having really exciting ideas, working with collaborators, most notably Hermes Patakos and Karen Lofgren, to make the costumes like alive. So the costumes in the show actually are not just displayed, they're actually kind of artworks in a way, or performances or performative objects. And that really I owe to you, Ron, because I was stubbornly sticking to my, you know, well, it has to be these categories and I have an argument and there has to be, you know, which I'm glad I was stubborn about it. But on the other hand, you know, just with a living artist, it's so exciting when they step in and you're really in dialogue, like right in the space. Also, you know, working with people such as Leah Ganjatano, who's one of the few curators, along with yourself, Jamillah, who would even consider doing the show. And Jamillah just put in so much time and effort working with me to make it happen. And resisting, because I had written and thought about the problem of how you write live art or performance art into history, I was very aware of all the things I did not want to do. And I hate to raise the specter of Marina Abramovich, but she's such a perfect example of what not to do that I have to, it's like the artist is present at MoMA is to me like the paradigm of the worst way to try to curate live art, which is you literally, everything becomes a spectacle, including your own body in the middle of the space, with people filing in to sit across from you and stare at your face. I mean, it's like a literalization of a desire to make live art into the kind of object fetish of the museum. So, and I was thinking of shows, some of which actually happened towards the end of my planning the show, but really exciting shows of kind of queer communities that relate to performance. And I'm thinking of David France and Ondine Chavoya's show, Access Mundo, Queer Networks in Chicano, LA, or Joseph Valencia and Paulina Laura's Liberate the Bar, Queer Nightlife.
Yeah.
Just like shows where, and of course they're always in more modest spaces and they're always kind of quieter in terms of the media presence, but those are the shows I find really exciting, the ones that are actually doing something so that you experience the show itself as a way that's kind of energized in that queer performative way. And so that's what I was thinking about. And thanks to, at ICA, you have the wonderful Peter Gould working with the show, who's the same person who helped do Access Mundo. So, he has a really good sense of how to help implement that idea so that you come into the space and there are these beautiful kind of living costumes that, Ron, that you helped display in the right way. And there's the documentation is part of a story. It's part of kind of the energy of a career as a whole or a creative life. So, I mean, I'm just blind to whether or not it works at all, but it's exciting to me.
It works.
Yeah, I walk in and I'm like, oh my God, every time I see it, I'm like, oh my God, this is so exciting. So yeah, that's, sorry to go on, but it's an exciting question to me. And I'm just so happy that I had a chance to work with you, Ron, to kind of see how to do that in a way that's more exciting.
I don't have any conflicts with the way that this performance work translates to walking through and actually looking at it up close. I actually find that exciting to look at the relics, to look at the research, like to see promo from Miss Velma's Universal World Church of her in the yellow dress, of the yellow dress that was rebuilt for Divinity Fudge, and how that just keeps moving through different pieces.
Yeah.
I think that's what gives it the overview. It's like the Lee Bowery dress, which I wore the year he died, but then Juliana picks it up in Judas Cradle. And, there's certain pieces that reappear. There's things that aren't even part of it, like the stolen T4 cell being infected by HIV. And how that is why isn't it mine? It's mine. The nurse told me to put it in a gym bag, so I did.
That's a real favorite, by the way.
It's the cross section. I think one of the video. Pardon?
Oh, I was saying that was a real favorite. A lot of people at the opening were like, "Oh, I love the stolen T."
Yeah.
my favorite three screen is it's Judas Cradle, Solar Anus, and Self-Obliteration. And the way they run in a loop on sync each image, there's always something horrific going on. There's something extremely melodramatic, like gowns flowing, butthole being opened up. It's always something profusely bleeding, if not all three together. But in three, it's a good 15-year span in those pieces.
Yeah, I mean, that's the last thing I would say is like some of the way a show like this comes into being also has to do with the particularities of what has remained, right? So with the work before the 2000s, you have analog snapshots in the archive and mostly pretty shitty video. I mean, depending, but normally you just have maybe a friend with a VHS camera, versus like as you move into the 2000s where the archive empties out and there are no more analog, there are no more photographs printed out. So I'm super worried about that for the future. But so I started just following you on social media, Ron, and just dragging stuff off all the time, some of which are new, some of which are you just scanning older things. But also you started to get bigger commissions where you could hire, you know, really ace people very experienced in film and performance and then editing those videos. So the later pieces have these more, you know, more and more elaborate and very beautiful quality. And 3 of them are actually screened in the state-of-the-art screening room at ICA, which is really exciting to have that extra space.
Well, I also had a change of heart about documentation because when I first started making work, I believed in the purity of the live experience. If you're either there or you're not there, and that's it, too bad. And then also technology then, if you filmed for camera and had live people that were so overlit.
Yeah.
And I'm a theater queen. I'm not trying to be a minimalist performance artist. I constantly quote Donatella Versace saying more is more. Like I'm a maximalist. So I don't want it overlit. I hate white walls behind a performance. You know, I came out of the black box era, not the white cube era. So light control, hazing to create light as almost a solid object, using real lights and not LED lights is, you know, important to me when I can pull it off. So I think it was really it was Solar Anus when I did performance for camera. Cyril, who made the documentary and documented the footage and also the Opie Polaroid shoot. He was in Nancy Buchanan's class at Cal Arts. So we had this rare opportunity to shoot that at like 9 a.m. with at least 4 to 6 16mm cameras. So that footage and from the different angles, and I learned that's the only way to make video look live or engaged instead of this horrible flat 90s high 8 far away gray footage that depresses you. Like, oh, dude, was it really that bad?
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast. You'll see, those of you who go to the show will be able to see a obviously converted to digital, but originally VHS tape made of the infamous 4 scenes in A Harsh Life. And we deliberately chose to put that on an old giant, like 100-pound monitor from the 90s, because that's what it was made to do, rather than pretending like it's the same kind of aesthetic quality as the more recent pieces. So that's another way of kind of honoring the history of the work and not trying to make it something it wasn't, or not trying to, for me, the shows where early work is conflated with recent work because it's all on the same kind of monitors, you know, that's the kind of thing as a historian that I find doesn't really work. You might as well show it the way it was and then try to flesh out what that performance was like. But you can't possibly recreate what it would have been like to be at Patrick's Cabaret in 1994, you know, and seeing that piece. And you might as well, people might as well realize that they can't recreate it.
For crediting how, you know, one, I live in LA where I had rent control. My 2-bedroom house was $600 a month with a detached garage. So I just boxed everything. But it still wasn't complete. So when I started working on the monograph Pleading in the Blood with Dominic Johnson, and, you know, luckily there was also social media then. So like how to find an 80s photographer. There's only about 5 photographers from the 80s. Like everyone didn't have a camera then. So I've always been in touch with Edward Culver, but how to get the no-mag photos, which that turned into like a David Lynch story where someone called me from a hotel with a suitcase, and if I wired her $300, she'd send me GIF files of these 5x7s of the PE, performance for camera for that, and then I could then credit my name from there. So that was like dodgy and weird, but also you realize an opportunity to get something that's now 40 years old, that she was always kind of horrified at having shot. So the negatives didn't even exist, just these 5x7s that probably the paper sent back to her when they were done with them.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful.
A lot of reaching out. You can really, if you just keep relentlessly throwing nets out, you start finding footage, flyers. It took me forever to track down the other PE flyer. And then one of Roz's collaborators had it scanned.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful that you have this. I feel like you have a lived relationship to the past, which is a weird thing to say, but it's not like this encapsulated thing that you don't think about. It's like you're constantly interested in knowing about the people and the images, and that's what allowed this show to happen, was that you've been collecting material. So there's, yes, amazing flyers from the early 80s for premature ejaculation. There's pictures of Ron with Roz Williams from that moment. I mean, it's very exciting just to have that material. And just as a historian, it was really important to me to differentiate between the images that you had as actual photographs versus we did make some kind of as facsimiles, based on having gotten a scan or a JPEG that's much more recent. So those are little nuances that are all, documented in the catalog and in the show. Because it's kind of important, like the difference between having an actual photocopied flyer, which has this like trashy physical presence versus something you print out as a facsimile. So that's super interesting to me.
Yeah, there's various levels of archive existing in the show, and the show really illustrates very successfully that like an archive that can remain active. It's not just this thing that's just married to the past. It's something that can continue to unfold and change and morph and develop as time progresses, which is really exciting, and not just sticking to, photographs or ephemera, but also all of these other objects that come together and form this active archive of an artist. So let's talk about the publication, which also functions as an archive, which was included, as I mentioned, as we all hold up our copies, and mine is blurred because of my background, which was included on the New York Times Best Art Books of 2020. And it's an incredible compendium that includes unpublished writings by Ron, object lessons, which is really exciting for the art historians and everybody to have that kind of looking at an object. Reflections and essays from a variety of sources, and a wealth of illustrations. It really goes above and beyond what is a usual exhibition catalog, but I want to be careful not to refer to it as such because it's its own entity. And I'm wondering if it was always conceived of in tandem with an exhibition, or how you imagine it functioning differently. And also, what are some of the things that you'll find in the publication that aren't in the show, and vice versa?
Yeah, definitely. It was actually conceived as accompanying the exhibition even before I had venues. So, and that's a whole other story, is like trying to get venues. But so that was, I mean, the short way of saying it is it's like the one thing I know how to do really well is write and publish books. I have no problem getting people to publish stuff I want to publish. I'm very fortunate. So I went to Intellect Press, which is a wonderful press, very supportive of kind of offbeat kinds of art and performance. And they had produced the Perform, Repeat, Record Live Art and History book that I co-edited with Adrian Heathfield. So, I knew that they got this issue of performance in history, and what do you do in book form that could enliven the practice and the lived experience the same way as the show is hoping to do? Also, I wanted to do Intellect Press because they published Dominic Johnson's Pleading in the Blood. So they had this like kind of, I mean, ironically, Dominic's book is much more conventionally art historical. And Dominic, Hidden Secret, did go to the Courtauld. So that's like, not many people realize that because he's known as a performance studies person. But the book kind of, it's a weird, like almost like a coffee table book of this like eviscerating practice, which I kind of love. And so the best part about the book is that they used the same font and the same basic design so that it functions almost as a companion to the more art historical book on Ron's career. At some point, I realized that there was so much to do with the show and the catalog that I couldn't really do it myself. Hannah Grossman was helping a lot with some of the earlier curatorial work, but I brought onto the catalog Andy Campbell, who's my colleague at Roski and is an expert on queer archives. So it was like a really cool way of covering, you know, someone who really thought about archives differently. And I was thinking more about the performance and the performance archives. And Andy really helped bring the book to life. And we are doing another event with ICA that will be live at the ICA next week, which is a book event on this catalog and Andy's book Bound Together and my book In Between Subjects, which is on queer performance and also has your work in it, Ron. I mean, what's in the book that's not in the show? I think the most important thing is a large section which is printed on different paper stock. So it's kind of cool, it kind of stands out. And it's Ron's writings and it's facsimiles from the archive of a huge range of writing that has never been published. And then there's a number of pieces that have been published that are reprinted here. And so, you know, rather than overwhelming the visitor to the show with, you know, massive vitrines filled with tons of writing, which doesn't really work, we mostly kept that to the catalog. There is obviously some sketches and writing in the show, but yeah, so I'd say the catalog really has that writing section where there's material that just goes really deep and wide and gives a different take on what's in the show.
I'm surprised how much people love the 4 scene storyboards.
Yeah.
Since '95, I didn't realize there was so much writing on, like even the whole monologue of the Butch Daner scene. And yeah, that's how I make work. It's just I keep writing and designing costumes, and then the rest of it fleshes out.
Yeah, so the storyboards were not in the New York show, but they are in ICA, and that's a great story because Ron, you had kind of lost track of them, and David France helped me track them down, and it turns out they'd been sold to the Walker, which was the site of the 4 scenes performance.
I had no idea.
Yeah, so people.
Can I just say, for the Walker, ever have only produced a half show, meaning we could only have half a cast because we didn't have any budget. So we scaled down a cast of 8 to 4. And then somehow I got kind of tricked to coming back to the 25-year reunion that I was going to do a performance, but then suddenly there's no budget.
Yeah.
So they had them. I was like, how did they end up with them? You know, all I've ever had to do is like really hard labor PR about something I didn't even understand at that time. Like that artists should have arts funding. I don't know. I didn't.
Yeah.
I have I guess a difficult relationship with them that I was surprised they ended up there via this collector Schiffler that also some Bob Flanagan, Sherry Rose things are.
Well, it's always easier for museums to have objects. So,
and it's the important part. I mean, we at ICA LA are not a collecting institution. We focus on exhibitions, publications, so on and so forth. But for museums that are collecting institutions, there is this want to tell, in some regard, part of their history. And the Four Scenes performance is entwined with the Walkers' history. So it's great for us that we were able to get the storyboards, because it's so rare that anyone actually gets to see anything like that, like, you know, a performance score or this kind of high level planning or thinking visually about what a performance will be. And because this is such a critically important performance for you, and also in your history and your mythology as an artist, I think it's great that they have them, just so that the next time there's a show about Ron Athey, which I'm hoping won't be too far in the future, we'll know where to find them.
Yeah.
It's important too that they are very large and they are confronting a tiny monitor of Jesse Helms, who's doing his little thing, his Ron Athey spiel.
Theatrics.
And so I kept trying to counter Jesse by all these different means, including the T cell model is also like close by, so it's infecting him with. So yeah, that was, I mean, it's weird, but I'm from North Carolina, so it was like an obsession of mine, was like to find ways to diminish him.
At least he died.
Yeah,
Like,
and not to focus too much on your position in the culture wars, Ron, because for a while that was kind of how you were known across the country, and obviously to focus too much on that is just like really inaccurate in terms of the complexity of your work. But
well,
to
it was
focus on
that I made a home somewhere else. You know, I just wasn't having it. I don't finish that. Since it didn't go anywhere, it all dissolved anyway. And then now we have this other dilemma of like weird billionaires being on the board everywhere and funding things. So it's almost a non-issue. Like that panel, it was already an old issue to talk about NEA funding and how it would affect artists on the street. It didn't.
Yeah.
Climate's really changed, and it's about how you keep changing with the climate and not get kicked aside by it.
Well, that's another point that goes back to your queer survivance issue, you know, just that you've always been able to kind of navigate systems and not waste too much energy feeling sad that Jesse Helms doesn't like your work or whatever. And I really admire that, because it's understandable when people get bogged down in those kinds of things because it's so personal. But
I firmly believe you don't have to live in the big picture. That's what's wrong with this moment, is everyone wants to be president or something. I don't get it. We have really juicy groups doing amazing things. And I'm not going to compare it against the top and then feel bad about being 60 almost. You know, and doing body work to get through this summer. And I have unstable housing still. You know, I have certain situations that I just juggle in this life. Yeah, I firmly believe in making a strong local movement.
Yeah. Just one more point on the Walker.
You know, I believe in a lot of things of not waiting for the system.
Yeah. And the Walker storyboards do feature Marianne Williamson, speaking of people who wanted to be president. And at least 5 people came up to me and said, "Is that the Marianne Williamson?" I was like, "Yeah." Those are your circles, man.
Minister, you know.
Yeah.
But what the show brings up in this conversation that we've just had brings up that's important is the idea of institutionality and the ways that museums can, you know, step up, and sometimes they don't step up and they fail. And, you know, the important thing that all of us have to do as artists, as scholars, well, mostly as scholars and curators and people that work within or adjacent to institutions, is to ensure that artists are continuing to be supported in the various ways that they need to be supported, being paid honoraria, being, you know, having exhibition opportunities, having publication opportunities, especially because the publication is often what lives after the exhibition or the performance, so on and so forth. So that, you know, this isn't the last exhibition of Ron Athey that we'll see. That's my hope, and that we'll continue to keep building the scholarship around Ron's work, so that there is this, ongoing conversation about the work and the ways that museums should always put aside, the noise from the outside. We're in this very interesting, fragile moment right now as well, where there is a lot of not as much political discourse as there was in the 90s, but people feel that they can talk back to museums, which I think is very important. At the same time, museums also need to listen and also continually think about how to be best partners to the public and also to the artists that they show or don't show. So let's pivot to Q&A in the last couple of minutes that we have. There was a question in the chat from earlier that I'd like to pose to Ron from KM in the audience. What motivated you to even begin live performance?
Well, that's a good question, and that does reflect on the early punk scene was a lot more cabaret than it's documented. So if the band Black Flag was playing, the fucked up classical string quartet Fat and Fucked Up might open for them, and then Johanna Went might open for them. So seeing, I guess it was the art door that opened for me via music, like seeing, actually I don't have the musical bone, but then when I saw the way Johanna twisted images and used motion to move through them, it kind of like something clicked inside of me. And then all the things like illustrated sermons started filling in the gaps of how that I would move through that. Resonance, like knowing about comb transmissions, performing in LA in the mid-70s about Susan Martin brought Herman Nietzsche in 81. It's like an 80-member punk orchestra under 4 inches of cow blood at a gallery in Venice that then poured into the flat next door through the walls. Like just hearing about the things where everything broke down. It was like understanding that performance could be sublime beyond description. And that kind of went beyond music for me. Also that time of industrial culture moving, like Throbbing Gristle, and talking about psychoneuroacoustics, like not talking about melody and good songs, but actually talking about like stressing out the audience or hypnotizing them. Yeah, all of those things brought me into performance, and it was such a real fit in my body that performing is just kind of an out-of-body experience for me. Like once you step on and go into it, that makes me feel like a channel, and that would probably be the only place where I compare it to my religious experience. Not so much with message, but with feeling.
That's the energy
when it works.
Yeah.
Here's a related question from Sylvia Sukop in the audience. Ron, my first live encounter with your work was back in 1996 when I stumbled onto a performance you gave at XXX Festival in Amsterdam. Sitting in the audience at that performance remains one of the most powerful experiences that I've had. Among other things, it broke open for me an attitude towards mortality that I found profoundly spiritual and sacred. Can you talk a little about the theme of mortality in your work over the years? Many people talk about the body's vulnerability in your work, but I'm also interested in the spirit. And please forgive the bifurcation of body and spirit in the framing of the question.
I think I always thought about those issues, but the AIDS pandemic and how many people I lost, and that I never had a real mentor because everyone died as I started to approach them. By the 96, I'd been through more than a decade. I'd already been HIV positive for over a decade. And the 3 therapy hadn't quite happened yet. So it was still all funerals, all hospital visitations. So I didn't have to think I'm going to make this work about this. It's hijacked my body and everybody around me. So somehow it just, through the archetype that the saints present for me, as like a Catholic fetishist as well, the archetype of the saints actually like brought me through that. And that's how I guess I would describe those as rituals, and constantly researching the saints. Like, it's not just faggoty Saint Sebastian and butch Saint Irene, but in esoteric stories, Saint Irene performed necromancy on Saint Sebastian and brought him back to life after he was arrowed to death. It's darker than just washing him and that somehow he lived. He couldn't have lived. Like a military army of archers shot him. So then the zombies walking and get stoned to death. So these are like bringing out the uglier sides of the saints, not just people being barbecued alive. And visiting people that look like barely living corpses with KS all over them, like the landscape of that moment. I think this is something a lot of what religion does the best when it expresses itself through grandiosity. Like, why do we need all those gowns and gold and jewels? Because it's for us, like this kind of grandiose communion. That's where those fused. And I think also grieve it. I still grieve. I grieve people that were there. No one could replace them. There's people that have left big holes in me. There's still amazing people who die, and I feel almost jaded at funerals. Like, oh, here I am. But if you don't do the collective grieving, you're left with this thing you never resolved either. So I try to go when I can. But I think that's why that crystallized in my work. And then just, I don't know, having to deal with being the survivor, like having so many, everyone's called me daddy, papa, father since I was 23. So many of my children have died before me. And that's like a devastating sometimes. Like another 20-something-year-old didn't live to be 35 that I was so involved with through whatever, mentorship, relationship, friendship, like all kinds of ways that you get in deep with someone. And again, they die before you. Or you look at a picture from the Club Fuck era, like everyone who started Club Fuck is dead. Miguel Beristain, James Stone, Cliff Diller, and especially Miguel and James, I were 80s friends of mine. We went back, and Cliff was like my child. So I think carrying that much loss and having to process it some way other than just being pathetic and wrong out over it is to see a bigger picture. And my archetype work is through Christian images.
Thank you, Ron. Amelia, here's a question for you from Jamie McMurray. Were there significant physical or conceptual changes between the participant show and our show at ICA?
Yeah, hi, Jamie. There were. It's mostly that because ICA is configured completely differently and also quite a bit bigger, we were able to add a lot of work. So I would say there's probably 25 to 30%, maybe 25% more work at the ICA. So I think of the participant show as a kind of goth teaser because we were able to point the entire gallery black and it's very narrow and you just kind of got drawn through the drama, the recursive chronology, whereas the ICA is this wide open space. We painted one of the walls black so you get that sense of the clubs and the BDSM, but it has a different feel. And it has those Walker storyboards, some additional costumes and props, some new videos. And one of my favorite parts is a little back section with some of the weird and wonderful items that friends have sent to Ron over the years. And then a wall of portraits of Ron, photographic and painted and embroidered by Franco B. So, you could do a whole show probably just of portraits of Ron. But, you have a little taste of that in the back, and that's queer community too, because those are all people who either were friends of yours when they did the portraits or became friends of yours because you're so irresistible. So that's kind of a cool moment. And then also we were given this screening room. So for example, the Vibiana Gifts of the Spirit, which is a grand operatic theatrical piece done at Vibiana in Los Angeles in 2018, is now on this beautiful big screen, among other pieces. So pretty exciting.
But let's not forget the context of COVID in February.
Oh yeah.
We had a 12-hour openings that 10 people an hour could come through. So
yeah,
which was gnarly because it's like having a full conversation with everyone who comes to the show. Yeah. And I waited till like hour 8 to start drinking. But I still, 4 hours later, I was cross-eyed. And then, just amazing to see some people that I adore, like the writer Cynthia Carr was one of the last people to come in. I thought, wow, when people really winter clothes on, like double mask down in their 70s come to give you a hug. It's like, it was a different dynamic going on at that time. And then also in New York, you can always do a hit and run. Whereas here, being here all summer and the amount of events that we're planning and stuff, it's a different high. And
and actually
out with the live, which I'm looking forward to.
It's worth mentioning we wanted to do a live performance, a participant, but because of COVID, it had to be done only for the camera. And actually that was just turned out to be a really interesting solution. So it goes back to your question, Jamillah, about, how do you honor live art in an exhibition? And this was just really fortuitous from my point of view, because I didn't really have anything to do with it. But Glenn Fogel, again, who's a video artist, had multiple cameras that he was live VJing a mix, live streaming it through the front window of participants. So those of us on the street could watch the performance in real time through this kind of scrim of the gallery front, which is so profound in terms of questions of representation and live art, and also the meaning of a gallery, containing performance art. And that piece he then kind of cleaned up and edited and included some of my footage from the outside. And that is now also being screened at the ICA in the screening room. So it's really cool to see that in terms of questions of curating live art.
And there's also this great prop that's in the ICA presentation, the Pacife box, that will at some point maybe be transported somewhere else for the performance, or when Acephalous Monster occurs later in the summer, the props will be removed from the museum and brought to the performance. So there's this, still this very active presence that's in the museum, because props and objects are going to have to leave in order to realize performances. So that'll be a first for us.
I love that. I love that idea. Ron, you were a little worried, well, should we show the props if we're doing the live? And I'm like, absolutely, because then we get to put the little label that says, this prop is currently in use in a live performance. And that is a great way of, saying something else about curating live art, that it's
it not all being about it's very much about even the present, and the Pacife with storyboards is the future for a piece called the Asclepion that I'm making with Hermes Patakos. That's not done yet, but it's good to be have this inertia and be able to share the process even as it's coming.
Yes. No, it's very exciting. There's these different ways of experiencing the work that are active in the show, what's to come, what just happened with the performance at Participant, and then all of the great archival material presented in various ways throughout the show. So one more question, and then we're going to wrap up, from an anonymous attendee. Ron, what would you tell young new artists who are getting into performance work?
the words of wisdom.
Yes.
I still have to trot out the DIY spiel because I find people get frustrated. They compare themselves to other people. They don't get the grant they applied for. They don't get the group show thing. Do it at a club, rent a gallery, get 4 other artists together and make your own group evening and try to start a relationship to what's similar and not similar about your work. But waiting for someone to take you on, be it a gallery or a producer, might happen in 15 years. And by then you will have given up. So if you have a fire under your ass to really make work and be an artist, you just have to make it. Make the fucking work and stop looking at the situations that are or aren't coming to you. There's never a point where I think, oh, I showed it in a museum. Why do I have to do this? Now, about self-producing. It's because I'm not going to sit and the ideas won't sit. And for me, once an audience sees something is when it becomes formal and official and it actually happened. And then I can have an opinion about what worked, what didn't. Because I don't do one-offs really. I do 3 years on the same piece until it almost perfects and then it feels like a play. So then I move on. But that's my particular process. But I didn't do it by waiting for the grant. I funded my early work by doing lots of nightclub shows, fetish club shows that paid for the props, the costumes, and also just to have this kind of like drunk ecstasy audience that didn't necessarily come to see you that you have to like top. So I think it gives you an impact to try different spaces instead of just safe gallery spaces. Or sometimes I feel like really boring work comes out of academia because just like-minded people critique you. It's like, what if someone just fucking hates your work and starts throwing bottles at you, and you have to, who are you in that moment? How do you rise above that moment? So I think taking chances, finding a context of place. I'm also not a public person. I don't want to perform in Pershing Square. Wouldn't, but so that's not me. But some people, the edge of the street, the grit of the street makes an action like raw and scrapes off the facade completely. Interventions are fabulous. Happenings are amazing. I've thought about that during all of COVID, that it's time to bring elements together in a happening and just see what happens with those elements. And instead of something that's as tidy as a curated package.
You're here. Well, we are at the end of our program. I want to thank all of you in the audience for attending. And of course, a special thanks to Ron and Amelia for this insightful and generous conversation. And of course, for the incredible exhibition Queer Communion, which is currently on view at ICA LA through September 5th. To learn more about our programs and exhibitions, including programs related to the show, and to purchase the catalog for Queer Communion, which is an absolute must, and also to learn how you can get involved with ICA LA and support, please visit theicala.org, join our mailing list, and follow us on social media at theICA LA on all of the major platforms. And as always, make an appointment to visit us at theicala.org/visit. And I hope to see you all downtown very soon. Come see our shows, support Ron, support Amelia, and kick off your summer. Thanks, everybody. This program will be archived on our website if you'd like to revisit it again, so stay tuned. I'm Jamillah James. Thank you. Take care and happy summer, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.